What's up, Melanated family? This is your boy Harrison bringing you a brand new episode of History Matters, where we explore different people, places, and things from our history, just so we can gather a clear understanding of what we've been through, so we can have a clear understanding of how we are to move forward. Now today, we are going to cover some of the Fugitive Slave Act, or the Fugitive Slave Act. It was a couple of them actually, but I think it's important that we look at some of the details surrounding slavery so we can get a clearer picture of what our people had to go through at this time. A lot of us are aware of the atrocities of slavery and how it has, crippled our people even to this day to a degree. But we need to look at, some of the laws and statutes that actually was put in place to allow that culture to thrive, okay? So let's get into it now. In an effort to prevent slaves from running away, the United States enacted fugitive slave laws. Now, the first law was created in 1793 and basically allowed the capture and return of a runaway slave to his owner. Now, the law authorized the local government to seize and return runaway slaves and created penalties for anyone that helped aid a slave in their escape. Now, an earlier version of these laws, called the Fugitive Slave Clause, was already in effect and basically stated that no person held to service or labor would be released from bondage in the event they escaped to a free state. Now, like I mentioned, in 1793, Congress passed the first Slave Act based on the pressure from the southern states, and the southern states basically claimed that the conversation of slavery was causing a wedge between the newly created states, and something needed to be done about it. Now, this law was similar to the clause, but it included a more detailed description of how the law would be put into practice. Now, one of the main differences was now slave owners and slave catchers could venture into free states to search for their runaways. Once a slave owner captured a slave, he had to bring him in front of a judge and prove the slave belonged to him, usually by showing a signed affidavit. If everything was proven to be legit, slave owners were then allowed to go back to their particular state with that enslaved person. Now, the North strongly opposed these laws and even went as far as to create personal liberty laws, which were designed to create a fair playing field and allowed runaway slaves who appealed the decision against them to be provided with a jury trial. Again, the Southerners were unhappy with the end result of the 1793 Slave Act, so in 1850, Congress enacted a new Slave Act, which was much more stringent and favored the slave owners much more. For example, if a slave were caught, he could not testify on his own behalf anymore, nor was he even permitted a trial by jury anymore. Now, as far as the legality of the personal liberty laws I just mentioned, they were eventually challenged in a 1842 Supreme Court case titled Prig versus Pennsylvania. The case concerned Edward Prig, a Maryland man who was convicted of kidnapping after he captured a suspected slave in Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Prig, setting the precedent that federal law superseded any state measure that attempted to interfere with the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, also, speaking on the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the punishment for helping a runaway slave was much harsher, and it forcibly made normal citizens help law enforcement gather runaways, and if you assisted a runaway, you could be fined up to $1,000 and face 6 months in jail as well. Now, to ensure the statute was enforced, individual cases were controlled by federal commissioners who were paid more money when slaves were returned, as opposed just allowing them to go free. Now, this sentiment further gave credence to the notion that the new law would benefit slave owners more than anybody else. It is also important to note that because of abolitionists and Northerners opposed this law, they would design a network of people meant to help runaway slaves seek freedom. That network was called the Underground Railroad. Now, people known as conductors would guide the slaves to freedom. They would hide them in private rooms, churches, and sometimes even schools. These were called stations or safe houses, sometimes even depots. Now in the 1850s, the Underground Railroad hit its peak with many enslaved men and women going to Canada to escape U.S. jurisdiction. Now when we talk about the conductors of that time, we would be remiss not to mention the most popular conductor, who was Harriet Tubman, who was basically born a slave named Araminta Ross. She took on the name Harriet, changed her last name to Tubman based on her marriage in 1849 when she escaped a plantation in Maryland with her two brothers. They actually returned a couple of weeks later, but Tubman left again on her own shortly after that, making her way to Pennsylvania. Tubman later returned to the plantation on several occasions to rescue family members and others. On her third trip, she tried to rescue her husband, but he had remarried and refused to leave. Now, legend has it, Harriet Tubman was distraught because of this situation and reported seeing a vision of God, after which she joined the Underground Railroad and began guiding other escaped slaves to Maryland. Tubman regularly took groups of escapees to Canada, distrusting the United States to treat them well, just like I said a few minutes ago. Now, also, by 1860, the fugitive slave laws were completely ineffective based on the North's reluctance to cooperate and the effectiveness of the Underground Railroad. And just to put it in perspective for you guys, the fugitive slave laws only really captured 330 enslaved people who were successfully returned to their southern masters. And at the end of the day, in 1864, both of the fugitive slave laws were repealed by Congress. Now, one last thing I wanted to add before I go, guys. The fugitive slave laws were set up to capture enslaved people, but at times they would capture free blacks as well. Because a famous case concerning a man named Solomon Northrop, he was basically a freeborn black man who was a musician who was kidnapped in Washington, D.C. in 1841. Northrop would actually end up spending 12 years enslaved in Louisiana before winning back his freedom in 1853. So ultimately, it was a good thing that those laws were repealed by Congress in 1864. So this has been another episode of History Matters. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. If you can do me a favor, guys, and hit that like button, hit that share button. If you have not subscribed to Melanated Fathers TV, please do so now as well. You can go on the channel and see other History Matters videos like this and other content that we provide. Once again, this has been another episode of History Matters. You guys have a great day.